walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino Podcast, episode 105. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
Another long walk has come to an end, which means another long podcasting hiatus has also concluded. I'm plugging away on new episodes now and hope to have a consistent trickle working their way online throughout the winter. This also means I've now concluded 6 full months of walking in Italy this year, over 6,000 kilometers, mostly on pilgrim roads. This last walk ran from the Swiss side of the Alps, over the Grand St. Bernard Pass on the Via Francigena, and eventually down to Reggio Calabria, near the toe of the Italian boot, and then over to Sicily for a broad, swooping arc that concluded in Palermo. There's so much to say about this experience. And as with the first walk, it'll work its way out gradually in bits and pieces on this podcast. But if you missed it and you're interested, you can find daily write-ups of the walk on davewhitson.com. Look for the Walk Across Italy tab near the top, and daily photos on Instagram at DaveXUSA. And in an example of the slow way that the long walk will gradually make its presence known here on the pod, this episode focuses on a route I walked back in the spring, the Via di Francesco, or the Way of St. Francis. This is not the first time I've explored that route on the pod. Way back in episode 3, I spoke with Sandy Brown when the first edition of his guidebook to the route was released. Nearly 100 episodes later, I finally made it there in person, and I was thoroughly impressed with the experience. It's one of the few routes I've walked outside of Spain that has a fully developed pilgrim infrastructure, a tangible pilgrim community. Even early in the spring, there were some muddy pilgrims around with me, and a palpable unifying pilgrimage theme and feeling. Plenty of routes have one or two of those, but it's rare to find all three. The Francesco has them. I'm joined for the conversation by Russ Eanes, who has not only walked the Via di Francesco multiple times, but also just published a brand new book on the stories of St. Francis, geared towards pilgrims on the road. The conversation that follows will thus explore both the ample merits of the Via di Francesco itself, as well as the life of Francis and his substantial legacy. Before we dive into it, one quick announcement and another acknowledgement. Fellow guidebook author Sandy Brown and I are coming to California the last week of January for a mini book tour, and I'll have a solo stop in Medford, Oregon on my drive down as well. More details to come, but if you're in Sacramento, the Bay Area, the Central Coast, Ventura, Los Angeles, Mission Viejo, or San Diego, or thereabouts, we are coming your way. Last thing, it has been a one thing after another situation in my life since my return home. Among other things, my microphone has suddenly stopped connecting to my laptop. I'm trying to figure it out, but the consequence is that my audio quality in the interviews is not great. Unfortunately, I don't know when I'll be able to resolve this issue. Any tech experts out there? I'm looking to connect a Volt mic through a USB-C port into a MacBook Air, and I've tried all the obvious stuff. But I decided that imperfect is better than nothing. So all of that said, 4 months later, even with a fuzzy voice, it's good to be back. Russ Eanes of Harrisonburg, Virginia, USA, is the author of The Walk of a Lifetime, 500 miles on the Camino de Santiago, as well as Pilgrim Paths to Assisi, 300 miles on the Way of St. Francis, and also the brand new Good Morning, Good People, Tales for the Way of St. Francis. You can find him online at russeanes, EANES.com. Russ Eanes, thank you very much for talking with me today. I'm excited to talk with you about one of the great routes that I had the opportunity to walk in Italy this year, the Via di Francesco, among other things. So thanks for talking with me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
One of the things that interested me as I sort of got to know you online, and I feel like this is true with a lot of the conversations I have. I talk with people who have existed in my head, existed as online realities for quite a while. But one of the things that I've noticed about you is, your first book was about the Camino de Santiago, and then your second book was about the Via di Francesco, and now you have this new book specifically about Francis. And I see you going back to Italy time and time again. A lot of people get hooked on the Camino de Santiago, the Camino Portuguese these days. They go back over and over again. But I'm always interested when someone gets hooked on a different route, one that's not quite as popular as the others. And it seems like the Via di Francesco sank its talons into you. So what is it about that route that first got you hooked?
Before I ever went on the Camino de Santiago, which is specifically the Camino Frances, which to a lot of people that is the Camino, but
Yep.
I was just looking at different routes and places I might walk in Europe. I only have a week or two at a time. And I saw this place. I don't know how I came across it, but I came across it. I said, "Ooh, that looks like an interesting one." Anyway, it didn't work out to go in the years before I went on the Camino. I'd been thinking of going there for 20 years. So the dream was to do the Camino, to take 6 weeks to do that and to unhitch from life. And it worked, and it changed me. It met all my expectations and exceeded them far beyond, including writing a book, which I never had an idea I would do about it. That was a surprise to me. And like the Camino, it was one of those surprises. The Camino has so many surprises. And not only that, I would enjoy the writing, but it would bring me into contact with so many people who would actually sell really well. I didn't write it to sell well. I wrote it because I loved it, and I was actually doing it as kind of a sideline because I'm a publishing consultant. And then I discovered, well, I always thought I wanted to write, never thought I wanted to write a book. I used to be a book publisher. I used to know that authors had a hard time with publishers. So, but the hardest thing was that just I didn't think I could stick with a single topic. Well, I was wrong. I could. But your question was, how do I know about it? Well, we walked the Camino in 2018, loved it. My wife joined me the last week, 10 days. And at the end, we said, hey, we want to do this every year. And so we said, well, what do we do next year? Well, I'd met a lot of people when I was walking the Camino Frances. It was like they were coming back year after year. And I thought, well, what I just had was a singular experience. I'm never going to have that exact experience again. Everything's new. Everything's unexpected. I don't know what's going to come next other than what the guidebook tells me. And that won't happen quite again. And there's just a lot of people there. I mean, that was 300,000 people a year. And I said, maybe those of us that have walked it and had that great experience, maybe we need to go somewhere else. And I eventually did do the Camino Portuguese, did it 3 times actually in the last couple of years. But I said, let's try something different. Well, in the back of my mind was this thing called the Way of St. Francis. So after I finished writing my book in 2019, I said to my wife, I think that's the one that we want to do next. So the book published in September 2019, and that's the month we took off for Italy. Never been to Italy before. It was absolutely wonderful. I found it magical in a very different way that the Camino is magical. So I was always very interested in St. Francis. Had been for, now 45 years since I first kind of read about him. My introduction started with the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, like a lot of people in the 70s saw that. Got interested in this guy. But I learned a lot more about his theology and other things, including reading some biographies. I looked it up. I got the guidebook, and, I realized it was much more challenging physically, a lot more challenging physically. Like I told people, if you start in Florence and walk to Rome, like the first day you're in Saint Jean, you walk to Roncesvalles. That's a hard day. If you can do that, you can do anything because that's a single hardest day. Well, it's like doing that day after day for the first days. So I looked at that and I wanted to go with my wife. And I knew she wouldn't want to do that. If she did Florence to Laverna, she'd probably say, that's done. So I looked at the route and I said, well, to me, the real place to go is Assisi. I don't care about ending in Rome. I'm not Catholic. Nothing the matter with that. But a pilgrimage to Rome doesn't stick in my mind. It's something I want to do. So I started looking at the route. And I looked at it and said, well, you could start and walk really anywhere. There's nothing magical about starting in Florence and going to Rome.
No.
In fact, I've come to feel that even more strongly.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it feels like Florence is just kind of an arbitrary decision. That Laverna is really the northernmost point to aim for, and Florence is an easy transportation point, certainly easier to reach than Laverna. And
something that people would probably want to visit, a lot of people, while they're in Italy. So they're in the neighborhood, might as well tack it on.
Exactly. And so, like, if you look at this early guidebook by the Italian Angela Maria Cercoli, she goes from Laverna to Poggio Bustoni. And over the years, as I walked it more and more, I realized, yep, that's it. Because when you're walking from Florence to Laverna or Rieti to Rome, there's really nothing Franciscan. Beautiful hiking, gorgeous countryside, history in every footstep, but nothing Franciscan. And so we decided to start in Rieti, south of Assisi, and walk north. The only English guidebook was Sandy's, and it was the opposite. So we're trying to read the guidebook going backwards.
Yeah.
I did get the GPX tracks, and that helped. Except for the GPX tracks were perfect. My phone wasn't. I discovered that my phone had a bug. It couldn't find me. And so that little blue dot was in the wrong place.
Oh,
and
no.
So when the route is much better marked now. Back in 2017, 2018, 2019, the route wasn't all that well marked.
And these days it is marked kind of for people to go in both directions, because I was going northward as well, and it wasn't perfect. And especially when there's a route split, I got myself into trouble one day. Caught it later with the GPS, but yeah, it's definitely better these days.
We lost a lot of time for a few of those days because we couldn't find the markings where the routes, where there was a fork in the road or a turnoff. But anyway, we laid out this from Rieti to Assisi, and even though, the phone wasn't perfect and the route wasn't perfect, boy, did we love it. Loved Italy, loved walking in the fall. The weather was perfect. It was like in the 60s, 70s, so 15 to 25 Celsius every day, and didn't have to carry as much stuff because we were staying in guest houses and hotels. I don't think we stayed in any hostels that time. And so we're carrying less stuff. We just didn't know what to expect around each corner, kind of like when I walked the Camino Frances. One big difference was we had a lot more contact with Italians. So when you're in the Camino, really any route, if you want, you can have minimal contact with the locals. Maybe the hospitalero, maybe the hotel desk, maybe the waiter at the hotel, at the restaurant. But especially in the Camino Frances, the international language is English. And even if people from anywhere in the world, they're speaking English. Which is, the community's awesome on the Camino. But in Italy, you're having much more interaction with locals. And when you'd meet other pilgrims, so one of the cool things about walking south to north is you meet all the pilgrims because they're going the other way.
You meet them once. Yeah. So I ran into, I think, 3 other people who were walking north in the same direction that I was. So you're right. The overwhelming majority of the traffic is south.
That's changing. I don't know if I had any influence over that, people reading my posts or my book, but people started realizing, hey, you don't have to do it that way. And I tell people you can really start anywhere and end anywhere if you want. But if you end somewhere, try to end in Assisi. The experience was magical. I picked a route that had less physical challenge and lots of hilltops towns because we really wanted to experience Italian culture and cities. And the second time we went back in 2022 and walked from Florence to Assisi. Well, so the first time we booked everything in advance, big mistake. The very first day, we're like, whoa, we need to change our plans. Well, it's too late. So the second time we said, make our plans a day or two in advance, see how it goes. We walked sometimes farther than we thought. Sometimes we walked not as far as we thought. And that was the beauty. We didn't, we could make a goal of like where we're going to be that day or two in advance. The flexibility made it a more special experience. But we encountered a lot more locals the second time. And even though we were walking north to south, we still met lots of pilgrims, but nowhere near what you meet on the Camino Frances. Nowhere near it. There's a lot more solitude, a lot more quiet. And because the countryside is beautiful, you can drink it in. You can't be lost in a conversation and just realize that you passed a 10th century church and didn't notice it or something like that. But we were just hooked. So that was in spring of 2022. We walked from Florence to Assisi. I said, well, I've never been between Rieti and Rome. So in that fall, I flew back, did the crazy thing, landed in Rome, took the train to the Vatican, snapped the picture, and started walking. Not bad. If you have enough coffee, you can get over jet lag walking. That's my advice to someone. I'm getting a little older. Maybe I'm taking it a little bit less, but I still believe it. In my opinion, again, the 2 days between Rome, the first 2 days, Monte Rotondo is the next town on the kind of official route, is not worth it. You can take the train to Montretondo and it's not cheating. So if I tell somebody to walk it, I did say someone recently who wanted to start in Rome, I said, hint, go to the Vatican, take your picture, walk around, and then go to the train station, get on the train, go to Montretondo. The route's beautiful. There's still no Franciscan history. You can go to Farfa, which is a cool place. I have not been there, but you have, I know.
It was closed.
Yeah. Oh, it was closed. Yeah. Well, that's part of the mystery of Europe, right? Spain, Italy, I tell people things are always open except when they're not.
Yep.
And who knows? But at that point, I said, really, the heart of this place is between the Rieti Valley, which has rich Franciscan history, and Laverna and the Upper Tiber Valley, which has rich Franciscan history. And, going north and south from each. And so that's where I focused. And I started going with groups a couple of years ago, and we focused it there. I think you see the best of the route. You find all the magic. You find the places of Francis, especially, the sanctuaries in both the Upper Tiber Valley and in the Rieti Valley are incredible. And you get a whole new insight into Francis.
When you make the north to south walk, it's framed as the Via di Francesco, but really it's two pilgrimages in one. You have the pilgrimage to Assisi, and then you have the pilgrimage into Rome. And I think especially this year, that was part of the allure for people going south because it was a Jubilee year. And so, hey, two certificates in one. You get the certificate in Assisi, you get the testimonium in Rome, and it's a nice combination. There's sort of the Franciscan tie-in that they're tracking Francis's journey into Rome and his relationship with the Pope a little bit. But you're right. For those who are interested in Franciscan sites, they do largely stop at the Rieti Valley.
Yeah, and to be quite honest, if he was leaving from Assisi to walk to Rome, he probably didn't walk on the way of what we call the way of St. Francis. He was on a road that's under probably 4 lanes and blacktop now.
By contrast, do we feel confident that the trails that we are following on the Via di Francesco north of there, around Assisi, are the very trails and footpaths that Francis might have followed?
I think many are. We don't know. He didn't leave calling cards. We can only look back at ancient maps or read history. And, like the Camino Frances, for one thing, there was no one Camino Frances. There were probably many parallel routes. And, the best road, the Roman road, is a lot of it's under asphalt. So after a while, you let go of that illusion. But there's some places that I stopped all along the way in any one of my journeys that you definitely feel Francis was here. The one that I was going to mention was in Fonte Colombo, which is one of the sanctuaries in the Rieti Valley, which some people think is the least special. To me, it's not the most special. I love all of them, all 4 of them, for different reasons. But it has that Chapel of Mary Magdalene, which was there when he was there. And it has the tau drawn in the windowsill. And I imagine him sitting in that chapel. So when I was there, I just took my sandals off and walked around in bare feet, thinking, I don't know if this is the same stone, but if it is, it's kind of cool. And it was cold, by the way. So I think we're in his land. He was a pilgrim constantly on the move, back and forth, back and forth. And I think definitely some of these trails we're on were his trails. But even if they're not, a lot of them are ancient trails. So I just think there's a lot of magic in walking in the land. I don't worry about whether it's his place. Even when you go into some of the sanctuaries, Greccio or Poggio Bustoni, well, those were caves, and now there's a chapel there, or in Greccio, there's a huge cliff-hugging convent, which looks like it's defying gravity. First, you can say, oh gosh, this isn't like it was when he was there, but it's in many ways, I think, spectacular what they've built. And I think they built it. I sense the love that was built out of it. It's like, This is Francis is special to us. Let's make this place special. And you feel that. That's my sense of the authenticity.
One of the things that threw me off when I first started looking into the Via di Francesco, just reading about some of the writings online, is it seemed really complicated. There wasn't just one Via di Francesco. There were all of these camini, all of these different routes, which, as you said, Francis was constantly on the move. So we're trying to cobble together all of these different itineraries that he would have followed in life. And so in my mind, I was thinking, when I get there and I have feet on the ground, I'm going to see all these conflicting waymarks. And on one hand, yes, there are some conflicting waymarks. There are different branded versions of Francis trails along the way. But there's also sort of one major kind of defining conduit that is pretty easy to track when you're there. I bring this up at this moment because you just brought up two very important Francis sites, Fonte Colombo and Greccio, which are not on that primary route. So can you talk a little bit about how this shakes out on the Via di Francesco? What do people need to know in terms of alternatives or variants as opposed to the sort of quote unquote main route?
Yeah, that can be confusing. And especially if you're familiar with the Camino de Santiago, any of the routes, they're well marked out. You don't need GPX tracks or a guidebook for many of them. I haven't walked enough to know. And by the way, I used to get lost on them because I would miss the obvious turn, the yellow arrow going like this, and my head's in the cloud, and I walk right on by, and suddenly I notice there's no pilgrims around. Umbria is really well marked, by the way. In Umbria, they have gone to great lengths to mark the route, and at every juncture on the quote-unquote official route, there is a sign, and I like that. But I tell people there are many variants. And so, for example, when I did this in 2022 and then with subsequent groups, we start in Rieti and we visit the sanctuaries in the valley first. We visit all four because that gives you a sense of the magic. And this last group I was with, I love the way that people were like, their eyes were open when they suddenly heard some stories and realized something about Francis. Like the miracle of the grapes at La Foresta is the story where people can get hung up about the physical thing of the wine. And I said, you're completely missing the point. The point of the story is about generosity and trusting God. And that's what Francis was saying to the priest. And then some people, their eyes were lit up and they're like, yes, that's the whole point of that's big thing of Francis. So I would say if you're determined to start in one place and walk without stopping, there are all sorts of things you can do, alternatives. But even if you just want a taste of it, I tell people probably start in Rieti and walk to Assisi. That's 11 days, 10 days, doable. There's plenty of places to stop, tons to see. And once you get north of, well, Spoleto's fabulous. And once you walk from there up to Assisi, you're going up through that valley along the edge of the valley in the foothills. And those hilltop towns like Trevi, Spello are just magical. You don't want to miss those. So that's a good way to get a taste of it. And then if you want to go back and you want to do some more, and if you don't, you can go all the way to Florence and you can walk to Laverna if you want, or you can just tough it out and get transport all the way to Laverna and then walk from there. And from Laverna, there are many, many variants. In fact, I'm going back later. I'm going back next year, and I'm going to do one of the different variants that someone told me is better. That's the other thing about the route. It keeps changing. When I looked at Sandy's most recent guidebook, he's changed his route, which it's just fine.
Yeah.
And I helped Matt Harms and David Landis with this book, and they've got lots of variants in there too. And I'd say to people, check out the variants, see which ones you want to do, see how hard it is, see what there's to see along it. Some days there are a few boring stretches, and maybe if you can take a variant that's less boring but a little bit harder, do the less boring and harder variant, unless physically you can't do it.
It's one of the things that I've always liked about the Camino del Norte is that there are so many variants that every time I walk it, which I've had to do many times over the years, it can be a different experience. And the same is true with the Via di Francesco, that you could walk it twice and follow very different routes each time.
That's right. And, I have an ambition one day to take about 2 or 3 weeks and go over there and just go to each of the little variants, not worry about starting here and walking to there, but like go here, take that variant, discover that, go back, take this other variant, discover that, and just write about it for people. I'll tell you a story. When I was walking the Camino Frances, I took along the Gitlitz guide.
In like hard copy?
Oh, yes, that hefty thing. People will look at me like, what are you doing with that thing? And I'm like, well, I gave up other things to carry this. And by about 2 or 3 weeks, they're looking at me sitting on a bench somewhere reading the history. And they sit down, they kind of sidle next to me. They say, tell me about this place. Okay, I'll tell you. And I would read them because that's a very detailed book.
It's amazing.
And that's, to me, the magic. You got to know where the countryside you're going through. You got to know what's happening what happened in this town or village. You suddenly discover, it's a sacred place and, or not. So to me, I think we need more of that on the way of St. Francis because there's just spectacular things about those towns and the guidebooks can't write enough. And that's part of what I've done in my books is I've added some of those details, and maybe someday I'll write a whole book about all the little variants and other things you can see and why you might want to go there. Anyway, I'd say these sort of quote unquote official routes, if you just want to do it, I would start on one of those.
When I think about people who are kind of stuck on Spain, Portugal, and it's not a bad thing to just want to keep going back to Spain and Portugal and walk over and over again. And there are a lot of routes there that capture some of that core magic that you talked about. There's continuity between many of those routes. And I think people are sometimes nervous about whether they can find that elsewhere. And the reality is that while there are a lot of great walking routes out there, they often don't have that same concentration of people, that community that exists. So you're opting for a solitary kind of magic on some of those routes. The two that I've been on that I think come closest to replicating that Spanish Portuguese Camino magic is the Le Puy route in France and the Via di Francesco, even more than the Via Francigena. I felt like there was much more of a community and sort of a focused intent and a pilgrimage ethos on the Via di Francesco. And you've already touched on some of the things that feed into that, but what else would you spotlight as being integral to that pilgrimage ethos that distinguishes the Via di Francesco?
I would say if you don't know about Francis,
Yeah.
if you haven't read a biography or a book about him, you're missing a lot. You don't have to, but you'll miss a lot if you don't read it, because it's so rich. His life is so rich, and there's short biographies and long biographies. You don't have to read a long one. When I researched my second and third books, I went into a lot of history, why was the Rieti Valley important to Francis? Well, it's because that's where he received a lot of early acceptance. It mattered him through his whole life. At the beginning, the end of his sort of spiritual existence as Il Poverello, the little poor man, it kind of begins and ends in the Rieti Valley as well as Assisi. So I would say that's one thing that distinguishes it. The other thing is just there's a whole lot of rich Italian culture. Yeah, I was taking in a lot of your recent journeys this year, and you know it. The Italians are so warm and welcoming, and understanding, and generous. That's why the second time when we went from Florence to Laverna, we opened ourselves up to just whatever happened. And we just had the best experiences, including experiences in a restaurant that were kind of goofy because I didn't know how to order, and they brought tons more food or wine or whatever than we could possibly drink. And it's like, well, that's what they understood we wanted, was that entire bottle of wine for lunch. There is a culture on the Camino Frances or the Camino Portuguese. For example, the Camino Portuguese, I think you've never had seafood. So come try our seafood out. I don't mean that in a bad way. They do have good seafood. But in Italy, there's just a lot of rich stuff to experience in the culture. And I think also there's enough pilgrims that there's enough of an infrastructure. But I don't know that they'll ever be able to have enough to have masses of people. And it's also challenging enough that I don't think they'll get enough masses of people, to be honest. There's no section of it that doesn't have some challenge. I tell people there's almost nothing in Italy that's flat. If you leave Spoleto and walk to Trevi on the valley floor, that's flat. That's about the flattest I can think. Or when you go up the Nera River Valley, that's also flat, but it's not for very long.
Yeah.
Even that undulates a bit. So I don't think there'll ever be the crowd. So that means if you don't want to see masses of people, or you want to meet a few pilgrims and get to know them a bit, that's a great experience.
And like Le Puy, and I think this is one of the advantages that the Via di Francesco and the Le Puy route have over the Camino, is that because the numbers aren't on the same scale as in Spain and Portugal, there is more intimacy to the experience of being hosted. And the Via di Francesco has a number of people who have opened up their homes to pilgrims. There's plenty of religious accommodation in monasteries and convents as well. So there's a lot of opportunities to feel that deeper connection to the people who are hosting and taking care of you.
Definitely. And in fact, that was one thing that just was wonderful for us when we walked from Florence to Laverna the first time, meeting the Piantini family. We contacted them. Could we stay at their guest house? No, it was full. And then she emails back, well, by the way, we have a couple rooms in our house. It's off route. And we're like, sure, whatever. And that was one of the best experiences, being with them, talking to each of them extensively, hearing about their love of the route, where they live, their house, their family. Never would have imagined that. That was a wonderful experience. And if we just said, well, we can't stay in the guest house, look for something else, we would have missed that.
So let's talk a little bit more about Francis. Francis has woven his way into this conversation at different points, and appropriately so. It's his way, after all. But I want to just talk more about him as a person and a presence. And one of the things that I really started to think as I was walking in Italy this year was that I felt a much closer connection to the saints in Italy that inspired these roots than I ever did to Santiago. For me, Santiago was, I guess, closer to a mascot than a living, breathing person. Whereas, as you said, you can feel Francis's presence here. It overlaps at one point with the Camino di San Benedetto. You can feel Benedict's presence. St. Anthony walked through here. He spent some time in Assisi before he took over the Franciscan efforts up in Padua. You can feel his presence. And again, these are living, breathing people, as I believe James was, but most of what we have of James is legend. With these guys, we actually have some history mixed in with the legend. And I think that that's significant and important. And thanks to your book, I'd love to have you draw upon some of that and talk about maybe like what's one of your favorite spots that hasn't come up yet, a Franciscan site, and a Franciscan site with a story that matters to you.
Yeah, I love to do that. And, it's quaint and fun along any of the Camino routes in Spain or Portugal to see the images of Santiago, right? Of the pilgrim with the hat and the cloak and the shell and the gourd and the walking staff is fun. For Americans, that's totally unusual. I don't think he's buried in that tomb. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you dig really deep into the history of the whole thing, I'm a pacifist. It's painful to realize Santiago Matamoros, the slayer of the Moors. There's a very deeply political thing behind it that you don't have to dig into that if you don't want. And any person doesn't have to dig into that if they don't want to. But I know that's all there. That drove the original creation of this sort of route. But then it becomes more than that. So it goes beyond that in the end. That's okay. There's nothing of that on the way of St. Francis because it was no route like that. Was the idea, the idea of Francis and his places, and let's link them together. I'll give one story of a place that's still maybe my favorite, though I'm not sure as I keep going back if it still is, but I love Poggio Bustoni.
Yeah.
Which is a dramatic, and it's one of these towns that clings to the mountainside and you wonder how it stays there. Very nice people. I don't think they realize, at least I don't get a sense that they realize what they have because there isn't tons of infrastructure there. And maybe that's good. I don't know, but they don't realize, wow, this is the gem to some of us. To go up there and then go to the convent, is it San Giacomo, and then to climb up to the chapel, the kilometer up. I always tell people I like that because a tour bus can't get there. It will never be mobbed with people. Though one time I was there, it was mobbed with a group of school kids, but that's okay. They're town school kids. It's their country, their place. That's okay. But I've also been up there when I was all by myself, and it was a magical place, and it was so peaceful. And these revelations that Francis had, and in my book, I just say they happened in one night. We don't know. We don't know exactly how they happened. But this first one, that all his sins are forgiven. And for us, we're wondering, why was that mattering to him? Well, because he was burdened by his life. And he kept thinking, I'm probably not the kind of person God would choose. Typical hagiography and stories about saints. Sometimes they have them as like saintly as like from the minute they're born. And there is frankly some hagiography of Francis around his time that depicted him that way. And I think there was some correction of that by some of his early followers. Corrected that? No, he wasn't. We knew him. That is significant. And then this dream that he's going to have 5,000 followers, I have them happening in one night. And then he comes down the mountain in this ebullience. Good morning, good people. Buongiorno, benedente. It's just this freedom and he feels. And the people obviously felt something from him. I don't think it was just what he said. It was obviously the way he lived, the spirit that he had. And I feel that when I go to Poggio Bustoni. If you're coming from either way, it's hard to get there. It is not an easy climb. I've walked it all ways from Rieti. So it's a tough day's walk. It's only 17 kilometers, but you go up quite a bit. And then when you finally spot the town, you realize it's still way up there. My first time my wife saw that, she said, "We got to go up there." Like only 2 kilometers, but boy, it was a climb. It's just a magical place. And, I think that's very special. I also, and one of my trips went to Cervaiolo, which is on a variant coming out of Pieve San Stefano. And that was an early Benedictine monastery that I think was in disuse, and they gave to the Franciscans, that also breathes kind of that Franciscan spirit. Monte Casale does. But
Yeah.
I love Fonte Colombo because of the fact that a lot of what's there was there when Francis's time, so it wasn't reconstructed after him. Some of it was. I love Greccio just for the sheer drama of that building. And La Foresta just has this quiet peace about it. And it's the only Franciscan sanctuary that I've been to that wasn't up high. I mean, it is a little bit of an elevation, but you're not looking way down on a valley, which is interesting. I think Laverna might be one of the most dramatic in that sense. So those are all magical places. Laverna has a very heavy overlay about the stigmata. And I'm not Catholic. I mean, I'm not let me speak against Catholics, but that's very important if you're Catholic to go there. And I've heard different stories about the stigmata, about their significance. I've developed my own belief in their significance, which is my own belief about them. It doesn't matter. It's a very dramatic place. But in Laverna, what I loved more than anything else was the big cleft in the rock that you can walk down that has an overhang. And I'm imagining Francis sitting there praying when there's nothing else around. He's picked these spots. So you get a sense of him then.
Yeah, Laverna is a striking place, and one of the things I loved about it was a rare moment on my walk where I was in a community of pilgrims. There's a very large pilgrim dorm in Laverna.
Yes.
Nowhere near full. In fact, there were only two of us in the dorm. Everyone else had gotten rooms, but there's that experience in the dining room, and it was a wet day, so most people were hanging out in the bar. So it gave me that sense of a place for pilgrims.
Yes, and there's another one along the route between Gubbio and Valfabrica, which is San Pietro in Vigneto. And it was now it's been a hermitage. It's been I believe, a Benedictine monastery. Now it's operated by the Confraternity of St. James in Italy. That to me was one of the most peaceful spots, and very welcoming hospitality, very simple, but so peaceful. And again, it's a place that was probably in existence, maybe looking largely like that in Francis's time. You can never quite know in Italy whether the stones sitting there that that have built a church have been broken down or reconstructed. You don't know. But I always say in my book, I touch the stones and imagine. I think San Damiano is a place that feels very authentic. And a historian can correct me, but I'm pretty sure that one reason it's been left alone, I mean, it has had reconstructions and different things, but it's largely like it was when Claire was there, because after she died, it fell into private hands.
Mm.
And so there wasn't a need to enlarge or change it. And when the church got it again, I think in the 19th century, when it was donated back to the church, there wasn't the need to change it a lot. And so you can sit there and imagine, I think pretty sure that the little sanctuary there was what Francis built. And they say that.
The other place you mentioned that really stands out to me, along with Greccio, which, as you said, is just a spectacular place to visit, is Monte Casale. And I think I get the sense that a number of people opt not to go through Monte Casale because it's up there.
It's up there.
The day that I walked up to it, there was a driving rain and it was slick, but I was going to make it because I had discovered on their website that they'll let anyone sleep in their open dining space, but they have one room, one single bed that they will make available to pilgrims. And so I got it, and I basically had free run of this former little monastery. I could go into the church, I could go throughout the interior, I could go say hi to the skulls, the relics of the former thieves. And if it had been clear at all, which it certainly was not, I imagine that the view from the edge of the complex is just absolutely stunning, but there's still something about staring off a cliff into absolute gray that's intriguing in its own right.
There is. The view is spectacular, and the stories that are attached to that. The story of Francis telling these two men to plant. Well, he tells them to plant the cabbages upside down, and one obeys and one doesn't. And the one who doesn't obey, he kicks out because he's like, "I'm going to ask you for a lot more to do a lot more foolish things than that." That rings true. And then the story of the thieves rings very true. Otherwise, why would that story exist? There's nothing about it that in other saint stories that beg telling. So you get that sense of the genuineness of Francis.
One Francis site that we haven't touched on, well, we've touched on it. You mentioned San Damiano, but we haven't really talked about Assisi yet. I don't know what I was expecting. This was my first time visiting Assisi when I walked there. I'm glad that I experienced it that way. I think that is a site that I would have preferred to come to from the north than the south. Because if you come in from the north, the basilica is the first thing you see up above you. Whereas in my case, coming from the south, it was the very last thing I saw. I had to navigate through the entire town before I made it there. But the wait was worth it. It's one of the most spectacular pilgrimage shrines I've ever visited in my life. And setting aside everything else we've talked about with the Via di Francesco, I think making it to Assisi alone makes this pilgrimage absolutely worthwhile.
It really does. I would agree with you. Coming from the north, you can see it maybe 10 kilometers away. You're approaching it. And then it kind of disappears from view as you head down toward the wood. And then when you come up, especially if you come up through the wood conservation, I've gone both ways. I've gone up the road, which was dangerous. And then I've walked up through the wood conservation. I forget what it's called, conservatory. And then you come into it that way. One has mixed feelings about it. And I've thought about it a lot over the years. And I just have such a deep affection for it because it's so beautiful. I think, well, Francis didn't want this. Okay. And I know a bit the history of why it was built and what happened. But history is more than just a decade or 2 decades or 5 decades after him. It's like 800 years now. And the place is just beautiful. And the frescoes in there are spectacular. And stop and think about which ones were chosen and why the stories were told. I have a guidebook on just the frescoes, and I spent an entire afternoon reading about each one and looking at each one. But it really is spectacular to see, not to sound negative, but if you go down to St. Mary the Angels and the church, it's a letdown because the portiuncula looks like a little toy inside the basilica. And not to put down, I understand why it was built, so no criticism of that. But, so that's where he was, on the portiuncula, and I understand how they need to protect it. Okay. But the Basilica of St. Francis really is spectacular. And the beauty in it, to me, is the beauty of the love that they have for Francis. That's the way I see it. And the way they preserve that beauty. I've been in the crypt where the tomb is, and I believe he's really buried there many times. And each time I go in, I learn something new. And in more recent times, I took in more deeply the 5 other souls whose remains are buried there, and took in that meaning. The 4 close companions and Brother Jacoba, the woman whose remains are down there. That is very touching to me, that they were buried there. And I think that's, now, they weren't necessarily put there originally. They've been moved there, I think, in more recent years. Matteo, Leo, Angelo, and Rufino. And there's a story with each of them. Rufino was a nobleman. It was Claire's cousin. And Angelo was a childhood friend of Francis. And Leo was the first one of the early priests that joined, was his confessor. And Matteo was this young man who has the story, why me, and who lived the longest. They're all there at each corner. And that, to me, says this also was important, this little community, because it wasn't just about Francis. It wasn't just about the single holy man who may have lived beyond us, what we can do, but this is community. When the recently moved Giacomo da Soli, the Roman nobleman's remains down there because she was so close to him. I've touched that they did that. That's moving. And the crypt, the tomb, is a place where I feel you can just sit. There aren't long lines coursing through like in Santiago where you need to keep moving, but it's like you can sit there for a long time.
We did an activity once at my old school where it's that one of those classic work meeting activities where you start with a list of core values and you circle the 10 that are most important to you, and then you start chopping them off, right? And you whittle it down, and everyone's going to see what their priorities were. And for whatever reason at the time, the last two that I ended up with were independence and community. And I remember my beloved colleague who was sitting across from me just started laughing at me because it just sort of captured this core tension, right? Like, how do you live when the two things you value most are individuality and community? They're at odds in a lot of ways. And I think about that with Francis and what you were just talking about. And this is true for some of these other medieval saints, where it seems like in a lot of ways, all that Francis really wanted to do was go sit in a cave somewhere. He wanted to spend a lot of time alone, or I guess in prayer, in dialogue with God. And yet he becomes a leader and he has a community take shape around him. And then at all of these different points, he's also making these significant efforts to connect with community, like at Greccio, the nativity scene, where he's quite deliberately going to create something for himself and for all of the people, all of the villagers there. And so I think that's something that's interesting to me about Francis, how he tried to straddle those two realities, those worlds, those parts of himself, the person who wanted to just be alone and the person who was a leader and immersed in community.
Well, I totally agree with you. And I've spent many years living in an intentional community. I've also lived in a community that was very Franciscan, though not Catholic. So I understand those values. But as I've looked at certain figures, and so in the 20th century, we have Dorothy Day and Peter Moore and the founders of the Catholic Worker, very Franciscan. And one thing that she does all the time, Dorothy Day is a fabulous writer, is she's always retreating from the hubbub of New York City, of the Bowery, out to these farms for a week or two or going on retreats. They need to recharge their batteries. They need to re-energize themselves. And I see that's what Francis was doing. So Francis is out among the people, serving lepers, serving the poor, preaching, traveling, talking to people about difficult things. And then he just disappears. I've got to go. And so the biggest insight I had into these sanctuaries was actually in the Upper Tiber Valley. So we're in Citerna. I don't know if you got there, but it's between Città di Castello and San Sepolcro. You can look across the valley and you can see over there's Monte Casale, up there's Cerbaiola. You can even see Monte Pene, which is where Laverne is. And then down behind you over here is Buon Riposo, which I've not been to, but it's another one. And suddenly it just dawned on me, he can see these places. You don't need a map. I'm here and I can walk a day here, and then tomorrow I'll walk a day over to that one and spend some time. Then the next day I might come down into town, then I go up to that one. It just all kind of hit me by looking at, but I had to be up there to see it. And then they weren't just dots on a map. The geography and his life and movement suddenly all came together, and I wouldn't have seen it if I wasn't there on the ground walking it.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are people listening who may have already stopped listening at this point, because there's a subsection of secular pilgrims, and I'm a secular pilgrim. You've mentioned that you're not Catholic, and so I think this is a good conversation for the two of us to have. There are some secular pilgrims who choose to put up a barrier between themselves and the more explicitly religious aspects of these routes. And in some cases that might be overt hostility, but in most cases it's disinterest, or just it's not something that they want to engage with. And so they might think, I'm interested in the Via di Francesco to see beautiful Italian hill towns and these historic sites. I don't really care about Francis. Why might those pilgrims pause, take a step back, and consider opening themselves up to Francis as an instructive or an inspiring figure, regardless of the religious aspect of it?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because probably the majority of the pilgrims I've met from Europe walking the way of St. Francis, and that is the majority I've met, are Europeans. They're not Catholic and they don't have a spiritual interest. I have met a few. Largely, they're not. It's like they've heard this is a good place to walk and they're down there walking it. But also some of them have said they begin to sense the spirituality of the route, and that touches them. They weren't prepared for that. And I think that happens on the Camino, but it's largely, I think, more through the community that it happens. Whereas in the Via de Francesco, I think it's happening just through the places they're seeing. Francis is such a universally appealing character. I mean, he is the man of our time. What does he give up? Money, power, and sex. Whoa, what are the three big things that are in the news constantly in our time? Money, power, and sex. And he's given them all up. He wouldn't even let his friars touch money. And that's amazing. If you dig into the story, I think you realize he's a man for our time. But to get back to your question about why they ought to, well, they don't have to. I mean, you walk you walk at your own pace and do what you want to do. But one of the persons I met along the way and walked, I mentioned a guy named Ed from the Netherlands that walked with me. He was stopping and lighting candles at little shrines. Wasn't religious. That was something he just had a sense of something spiritual, and he wanted to do that. I was touched by that. I actually started doing that myself after, well, I think I did it on that walk too. I decided I was going to try to bring some votive candles and leave them in places, and trying to be more intentional about leaving things behind as a kind of a discipline of pilgrimage. Not trash, but leave things behind that are meaningful. And by the way, I leave shells and things behind. I'm happy if people pick them up and take them. I have this funny thing like take one, leave one, if you want. So you can do it. And that's what I experienced most of them doing. But it's interesting. A few that have been in touch with me later have talked about sensing something while they were there that they hadn't. That wasn't just a hut hike through the mountains.
I have one last question for you, and it's still about Francis. And it's the thing that I found myself grappling with as I walked along the route and thought about Francis afterwards, and thinking about Francis as an ethical role model, not an explicitly religious one. The thing that I struggled with is there is this core tension, in my view, between his beliefs about poverty and austerity and the inevitable moderation of some of these more extreme positions as the years passed, which is the story of every monastic order in history, right? Like yep. We come about, we're going to get back to basics. We're going to get rid of all of this waste and gluttony and all this stuff. And then, they gain some power and get settled and buy some books. And all of a sudden it goes downhill from there. So on one hand, it's easy to dismiss Francis's approach as impractical to modern times, like noble, great, but you just can't scale it. On the other, I wonder if the efforts to accommodate Franciscan values to our contemporary lifestyle undercuts them completely. In other words, like when we claim to be following Franciscan values, I see this with Buddhism too. When people claim to be following those precepts, are they inevitably watering them down in such a way that it's almost corrupting? It's warping them beyond their original value and distorting them for people who don't know anything about Franciscan values into losing sight of what was at the heart of it. So I wonder how you approach this. You've talked about your interest in Francis, the appeal of him as a figure to you. How do you think of this in terms of applying Franciscan values in moderation? Is it possible? And what does that look like?
It's definitely possible. Try it as much as you can. The thing about Francis that actually is really appealing, among other things, is he was tremendously gracious. So think about him. I mean, he could have preached against the power and wealth of the church and been executed for it. The church instead protected him without asking him to give it up. They saw this tension, the leaders. So Gregory IX, who builds his basilica and is president for his canonization, was a former Bishop Ugolino, a cardinal, who was kind of his protector. He was a very gracious person to anyone. That's why he starts a third order. He recognizes there are people who are not going to give up marriage, who have to live in the world. And he also, in the end, he really didn't want to be the leader of a movement. That wasn't what he was all about. He wanted to be part of an itinerant band of people that loved other people. He was shocked, I think, at the size of his movement. And then we've got to, create rules. And now how about all these exceptions? And at that point, he just starts to bow out. Literally bows out. His health was really bad toward the end of his life. I mean, his health was never good, but it was really bad the last, 5 to 10 years. I think that whatever one can find in Francis to emulate, but especially the simplicity and the grace toward others. So this is one thing that's come to me a lot more in my own life as I've gotten older, is to be gracious toward others, to allow them to be where they are, and to see no one as a finished product, but as someone on a journey, a pilgrim moving through life, And I think that's It's a tragedy when someone dies at age 45 that you wonder what would they have thought at 65 or 70. You don't get the long thought. And so many of the figures of history, even our political figures that die young, we don't know what they would have thought. And I'm always amazed when I meet people or read things that they've written later in life and how they've come to see things. And maybe they've softened, but maybe they've also become wiser. So we don't have that in Francis. We're just left with where he was 45, he's gone.
Yeah.
And actually, a writer I'm reading a lot this year is Henry David Thoreau, the American. He was also dead at 45.
Yeah.
Also profoundly impactful. What would they have thought if they'd lived longer? Well, we don't know. And I think that the love and the simplicity, and I think the Franciscans maybe as an order have kept that better than any other order, but that sounds terribly judgmental because there are so many hundreds of Catholic orders that I don't know them all.
Yeah.
But they really have continued that. And he's also inspired other people. So one of the things I researched in my last book or stumbled across was Carlo Carretto, who was this Italian who was actually buried in the little convent outside of Spello, who was the leader of a small community, Catholic lay community, very Franciscan, but he's not specifically Franciscan. And you find this in movements over time through history. And that's something that also struck me as I researched my books with people who've, even Francis's time, you see the people in the first century after that who are third order. Maybe they're a queen or a king, and they realize they've got all this power. What do I do with it? How do I live my Franciscan values? And they're wrestling with it. And that's kind of what I think life and faith are all about. How do I wrestle with these values and the reality of life in front of me? It's never easy.
You've mentioned your new book a few times, and it's new. It's not just kind of recent. It's Good Morning, Good People. And
yes,
it's out now, right?
It's out just now. Yes. And it's a real niche book. I mean, this is not a bestseller. I wrote this. This is a labor of love for those who walk the way of St. Francis that want to know the stories. So I put the stories in the places. The book is written chronologically. There's an index at the back. If you're in Monte Casale and want to know which story that was, you can find the story of the thieves. It's to trying to bring those stories and places together for people. Because to me, that's what the whole value of the pilgrimage is those stories and the places together. So yeah, Good Morning, Good People is just launched. And I've done it for pilgrims that want to know more about the stories of Francis.
And I'll just add that when I'm walking, I try to find audiobooks through Libby that I can listen to. And so I was looking for biographies of Francis. There are a lot of them out there, but not a lot in audiobook form on Libby. I ended up with G.K. Chesterton's book. It's a little old these days. And my comment at the time was it felt like it was more about G.K. Chesterton than it was about Francis. But what I appreciate about your book is that it is efficient, it is breezy, and it hits all of the key points. And I mean that all of that in the nicest way possible. It's the kind of book that is very much, as you said, geared towards the pilgrims who are walking through, who want to be able to digest the stories in an accessible way and understand where they can see that firsthand on the trail. And you connect those dots for them.
Thank you. And that's why I made the book so small. My hope is people would actually stick it in their pack. I know that sounds old-fashioned, but honestly, one of the things I encourage people to do when you're walking in a pilgrimage, get your nose out of a phone, look around, and touch something.
It weighs a lot less than Gitlitz and Davidson.
It does. It's a fraction of that. And if I did that, you can carry this.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Russ. I've really enjoyed this.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
In the medieval text, The Little Flowers of St. Francis, the author describes a key event in the life of St. Francis. Here's how it begins. In the days when St. Francis abode in the city of Gubbio, a huge wolf, terrible and fierce, appeared in the neighborhood, and not only devoured animals, but men also, in such wise that all citizens went in great fear of their lives, because ofttimes the wolf came close to the city. No, this was not the beast of Gévaudan, making its way south from France into Italy. It was a whole different kind of vicious wolf. Russ picks up the narrative from there in Good Morning, Good People, writing that Francis, out of compassion for the people of the city, found and then confronted the wolf. According to Little Flowers, the wolf, teeth bared, leapt toward Francis, but was stopped by Francis giving the sign of the cross. Addressing him as Brother Wolf, Francis admonished the animal for having attacked and killed both men and cattle, and for terrorizing the people. But then, rather than condemning him, he extracted from the creature a promise to change his ways and become peaceful. Moving on from Russ's account, I'll offer that among his many other roles, over the years, Francis became the patron saint of animals and an inspiration to animal rights activists and animal lovers around the world. Search the internet and you'll find this quote attributed to Francis on a million different sites, so it must be legitimate. If you have men who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you will have men who deal likewise with their fellow men. All creatures have the same source as we have. Like us, they derive the life of thought, love, and will from the Creator. Not to hurt our humble brethren is our first duty to them. But to stop there is a complete misapprehension of the intentions of providence. We have a higher mission. God wishes that we should succor them whenever they require it. And even if that quote's entirely apocryphal, the sentiment seems consistent with how Francis's outlook on animals has been documented across the many accounts. And I'm trying to keep that in mind right now, as I attend to 4 dogs, 2 of whom kept me up from 1:30 this morning with upset stomachs. As Russ advised, I suppose that I can extend them at least a modicum of grace, but no extra treats. At least for today. That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Russ Eanes. You can find his books, including the brand new Good Morning, Good People, on Amazon. And you can find Russ online at russeanes.com. All episodes of the Camino Podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can reach me at caminopodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. And you can support the pod on Patreon at patreon.com/Dave Woodson. Back next week.
Nobody asked me